Hello and welcome to the cesspool, and more importantly, welcome to Committed, the series that gives me the excuse to talk about one of my own guilty pleasures, old psychiatric hospitals. I know this is a huge step away from the usual content here on the cesspool, but give it a try and you might just like it. Hi, I know it's been a while. We set a lot of dates for this video, and those dates have came and definitely went. But now it's here! The work that went into making the traditional episodes of Committed has always been daunting and ultimately not super enjoyable for me, definitely on the research and historical image searching side of it. It would take hours and hours and hours to collect enough images specifically to actually fill the 20 plus minute time slot of Committed 2 and definitely for 3, which is probably what made that passion that I originally had for these videos go out for a while. For lack of better words, the flame had definitely extinguished. But now we're back. I've gained a little bit of more passion, and I've taken a different approach to the visual medium of things. And I think that's ultimately what took so damn long. So without further ado, let's see what everyone's been waiting like almost 2 years for. Our story takes us to the towns of Thiels and Stony Point, New York. Less than an hour away from the Big Apple, these small hamlets were pristine getaways from the hustle and bustle of the big city. With beautiful natural scenery and wide empty spaces, the area seemed like an ideal location for a large, self-sustaining mental health facility. The state of New York and its president of the Board of Charities seemed to agree. That head, William Pryor Letchworth, was once a wealthy businessman who worked his way up to the top of the very successful Letchworth and Pratt Ironworks Company. As a Quaker, Letchworth retired early at the age of 46 and devoted his life to charity work, especially with the less fortunate children. He was appointed to the Board of Charities of New York in 1873, becoming president in 1878. Letchworth approached the board with a vision for a radically different type of facility to care for the mentally disabled, especially focusing on the treatment of children. Instead of the massive wings and soaring towers of the traditional Kirkbride design of the time, he wanted a more intimate and community-oriented institution that could function more as its own little village. He wanted there to be a working farm on the property to give the patients a sense of purpose, a method of occupational therapy that was growing popular at the time. Letchworth's plan was approved in 1907, and in 1909 a 4-square-mile parcel of land was acquired in the towns of Thiels and Stony Point to construct a Letchworth's revolutionary facility. The buildings of Letchworth were laid out in what would later be known as the cottage style of asylum architecture, essentially a bunch of smaller buildings that had a more communal feeling to them. The buildings were designed by Wells Bosworth in the neoclassical style, taking inspiration from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and built using local fieldstone. Letchworth's vision saw the structures of the village to be no more than 2 stories, and only a single story for the dormitory buildings where patients were housed. They would house up to 70 patients in total, but be even further separated within the buildings themselves. As mentioned previously, Letchworth did much of his charitable work with children, and his new facility would be no different, primarily designed around and focusing on the treatment of mentally ill children. As a result, playgrounds were required at all the dormitory buildings, including basketball courts and swings. Of course, many other structures were needed and constructed in the same architectural style to complement the dormitory buildings. Recreational facilities, most famously Kirkbride Hall at the adult male section of the facility, were constructed along with medical infirmaries for either sex and a hospital at the end of the young boys section. A large power and maintenance facility was also constructed, along with a spur of the New York and New Jersey Railroad, a subsidiary of the Erie Railroad connecting New York and Chicago. Various other utilities and office structures were constructed on the property, including large administration buildings for each section of the facility that would act more as centerpieces. In 1911, Letchworth Village opened its doors, accepting its first patient, Gustav Jacobson, on July 11th. Unfortunately, William Pryor Letchworth, the man who championed and dreamed up this revolutionary facility, failed to live to see it ever open its doors. He died in December of 1910 at the age of 87, and the village was named in his honor. From opening day, the hospital's superintendent was a well-known psychiatrist, Dr. Charles Sherman Little. With Little at the helm, Letchworth Village was a prosperous and highly regarded model of mental health care. He expanded the campus to ultimately house over 130 structures. The patients during these early years were well cared for by the staff and given a plethora of occupational treatments, as well as high-quality educational programs for the large population of children. Farming was a primary activity for patients, as well as other skills such as carpentry and repair work. The patients also built and sold their own toys around the holiday season. The farm at Letchworth Village was so successful, in fact, that the facility was completely self-sustaining in food until 1958. While on the outside the facility was receiving high praise for its design and treatment of its patients, things on the inside were slowly starting to crumble. In 1921, Dr. Lill published the annual report in which he grouped patients based on their feeble-mindedness, referring to the patients as either morons, imbeciles, or idiots. These words, of course, are incredibly insensitive today, but at the time they were at the very least acceptable in the psychiatric world. Dr. Lill designated those vital occupational treatments and activities that gave Letchworth such a good name to the patients based on those designations. He went so far as to completely devoid the idiot group of any of these occupational treatments, and even went on to say that they were unable to benefit the state, which just shows his complete lack of faith in an entire demographic of his patients. Another extremely crippling and unfortunately far too common issue that began to plague Letchworth as the decades started to pass was overcrowding. In the 1921 annual report, it was reported that there were about 1,200 patients at Letchworth. Through the early 1930s, the hospital continued to strictly follow the guidelines and rules set by William Letchworth regarding the avoidance of institutionalization of the patients that plagued so many other state-run psychiatric hospitals. Unfortunately, by 1935, the facility had officially become overcrowded, crossing its 3,000 patient threshold as it continued to take in patients from other psychiatric hospitals in the region, particularly the infamous New York City Bellevue Hospital. This resulted in dormitories beginning to fill way beyond their capacity, as well as completely different buildings that were never intended for patients filling with new arrivals. The state of New York did have a plan to solve this problem with the construction of Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. However, the Second World War was raging during this period of construction. The Army took over the facility before it was ever able to begin receiving patients, and as a result, was unable to take the patients from Letchworth, which severely crippled the facility. After the war, Willowbrook would open, however it was too little, too late. Although on the inside, Letchworth Village's ideal intentions and methods were beginning to show signs of structural failure, it wasn't until the release of the photos by famous photojournalist Irving Haberman that the public was able to get a small glimpse of the conditions at Letchworth Village. Patients were seen filthy and sleeping without bed frames on the floor of the dormitories. These images were startling. However, they showcased the facility only in its very early stages of falling from grace. During this time, Letchworth was still incredibly successful in its overall treatment of its patients and the devotion of the staff. The doctors did important research into the treatment of the mentally ill, and it's important that with many of these facilities, the intentions were ultimately good, even as the conditions inevitably worsened. Spoiler alert, things do get worse. Much, much worse. One of the most controversial pieces of research done at Letchworth involved the vaccine for polio of all things. Dr. George Jervis, the superintendent of Letchworth during the time, was approached by Dr. Hilary Koprowski. Koprowski had been developing and successfully tested a live virus vaccine for polio in 1948, doing the test on himself as well as an assistant in his lab. He asked Jervis to allow him to use Letchworth patients as his next subject to test the vaccine on, which Jervis agreed. Dr. Koprowski administered his vaccine to an 8-year-old boy and soon after another 19 children at the facility. The results showed that 17 of the children did develop effective antibodies, and the experiments were considered a success without any complications to the test subjects. While it can be argued that this was ultimately a positive event in the history of Letchworth that benefited the public, the moral ramifications are far too large to ignore. These tests were done on unknowing children with a vaccine that had been tested in only an extremely limited amount. It could have easily resulted in serious complications that those children would have to live with for the rest of their lives. It is completely unacceptable that this was ever allowed to happen, and although it was a benefit, as it ultimately helped to push the polio vaccine more quickly to the general public, it could have been executed in a far more humane method. Throughout the 1950s, the conditions at Letchworth continued to worsen, completely out of control of the staff. Funding was being cut to the hospital, and the patient count continued to rise. The administration at Letchworth pleaded with the state for more support and funding. However, like many institutions at the time, they ultimately turned a blind eye. This did not impede the attempt made by the facility to continue occupational therapy, however. Even with a population well in excess of 4,000 residents, up until 1958, patients were still tending to the farms and building Christmas toys to sell to the community. That population ballooned to at least another 1,000 by the 1960s as funding and conditions at Letchworth fell even further. Now, with these increasingly worsened conditions, it was only a matter of time before they were exposed, and it took an expose on a far larger scale than Letchworth itself to reveal what was happening. Geraldo Rivera, reporter and investigative journalist for ABC, was given exclusive access inside multiple state psychiatric centers in the state of New York, most prominently Willowbrook State School on Staten Island in 1972, hence the title of the report, Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace. However, Letchworth was on that list of other locations Rivera was given access to. Rivera, along with Congressman Mario Biaggi and his team, arrived at Letchworth 2 hours early to ensure that the staff had not tried to clean up the conditions at the facility. Despite the fact that the team was already on the campus, the staff still attempted to make the conditions appear better than they were before the official tour was set to start. However, the damage had already been done. Even though Letchworth had gotten little screen time in the actual report, it was enough to open the eyes of both state, government, and the public alike. What you're about to see is disturbing, so if you'd like to skip this clip from the Rivera report, here's the timestamp.
Way to Bear Mountain is a lovely looking place called the Letchworth Village Rehabilitation Center. Set among the hills and woods of suburban Rockland County, a passerby could easily mistake the place for a country club or a college campus. But the early morning mist gave the place an eerie feeling like a set from a horror movie, and once inside, that feeling became suddenly appropriate. Congressman Mario Biaggi had planned an official tour of the facility for 10 o'clock in the morning, but by this time, wary of what I felt were attempts on the part of the Department of Mental Hygiene to make the situation look better than it really was, my camera crew and I got there 2 hours before that. As the hour of the official tour approached, bundles of clothing were brought in for the children and a process of cleaning up was begun. Even so, none of these cosmetic changes could do much to improve the place.
Who's in charge here, Jerry? This is Mrs. Nixon. I'm Congressman Biaggi. How are you? Why are these patients unclothed?
We don't have enough clothing. We don't have the proper help to keep clothing on them. We have a few nudists that will not keep clothes on. They will pull them off. But most of all, we don't have the help to keep the kids properly dressed.
You're talking about more money for the institution.
Well, that we could use because then we will have more help.
How understaffed are you?
Very understaffed. There are days we have 4 or 5 attendants to take care of 100.
Condition in a very beautiful ground, very well-built buildings. Inside we have housed the children of many of our citizens who are subjected to what appears to be the worst possible conditions I've ever seen in my life. I've visited penal institutions all over the country. I've visited hospitals all over the country. I've visited the worst brigs in the military. Nothing's like it. I've never seen anything like it.
About 25% of the funding for Letchworth Village comes from the federal government, and one of the requirements for continued eligibility is that there be 80 square feet of space per patient. Here they get only 35 square feet. In the face of this terrible overcrowding, there was a ward there that stood empty because they hadn't the funds to hire the 38 people it would take to staff it. How can this be?
Well, we need 38 additional positions, and we would be able to staff this area and reduce our overcrowding in overcrowded areas.
That's a sin, my God, a sin.
Well, we have submitted, and we're expecting that we might be getting them, and then we'll be able to reduce the overcrowding in certain areas.
There's at least one more horrifying aspect of life at Letchworth. More than 300 able-bodied patients, both physically and mentally able to work outside the institution, are not being allowed to. They're being used to fill the places of the too few employees. They get paid $2 a week for their efforts, about what they'd make each hour on the outside.
Although another 2 decades had to go by, this report marked the effective end of Letchworth Village. The Rivera report created a level of public backlash that forced the state's hand. In 1978, Letchworth was finally beginning to address its overcrowding and lack of adequate care by releasing and relocating its patient population. In turn, the patients who actually stayed at Letchworth were able to obtain better care, conditions, and privacy. This wasn't just out of the goodwill of the administration, however. With the 1970s came the deinstitutionalization movement that so many state-run psychiatric facilities faced during the decade. The state of New York wanted to unload these seemingly outdated, decaying, and expensive facilities with the advent of new medical advances in drugs and care practices. Throughout the 1980s, Letchworth's population continued to decline steadily as the patients were released to group homes and given initiation programs at the facility before release into civilization. Admissions were slowed to a crawl as well to ensure the seemingly planned ending of Letchworth was assured. The state got its wish in 1996 when Letchworth officially shut its doors for good after a tumultuous 85 years in operation.